welcome you into a fresh new hour of CBS Sports HQ. I'm Haley Sutton, guiding you along the way. We got a lot to talk about, but we start, of course, in college football news. A lot of things swirling around with the latest weekend, so let's get you up to date with the title competition. And we're going to start out in the Big Ten. Number 1, Oregon continues to coast at the top, grinding out a 16-3 win over Wisconsin this weekend, all thanks to an Atticus Sappington field goal late in the game. The Ducks' unbeaten season continues as they inch closer to the final CFP ranking and that bracket reveal. Oregon's path to the Big Ten championship is simple: win and you're in. Now, if Indiana wins and Penn State loses this week, the Big Ten championship game will be Oregon versus Indiana. However, we know the challenge for Curt Cignetti's crew. It's a clash with the best roster money can buy as Ohio State and Indiana go head-to-head. The Hoosiers having their best season in program history, trying to prove they belong in that big game, but Ohio State always with something to prove as well. That one getting underway this Saturday. Over in the SEC, the Georgia Bulldogs putting the committee on notice after a must-win victory over Tennessee this weekend. Remember, they were left out of that initial college football playoff bracket, but now their chances to get in jump to 80% after that big win over Tennessee. You can't not have the SEC in the college football playoff, I'm right. Taking a look here at the SEC's chance to make it in. It is Texas, no surprise, that has the best chance at 97%. They did lose to Georgia earlier this year, but they have been on pace to be one of the best teams in the country all season long. Alabama is also in the mix. They got that big win this weekend over Mercer. Tennessee, even though they lost, they are still at it. Some work to do from some of those other teams, though. Texas A&M, an outsider looking in. Ole Miss, one of the more interesting storylines as well. They did get that win over Georgia last weekend. Over to the Big 12, it's Colorado controlling their own destiny. What a turnaround for the Buffs. Not a great season in year 1 under Deion Sanders, but they have been proving this season they can be a top competitor. They're now in position to go bowling already, potentially more. They can clinch a title game in the Big 12 with a win, an Arizona State loss, and an Iowa State loss this weekend. So they're going to need some help, but the big thing here is they have to continue to take care of business. Oh, by the way, don't forget about Boise State over in the Mountain West. The Broncos back on CBS Sports Network this weekend as they take on Wyoming. Boise State could get that Group of 5 bid if they win the conference. It's Colorado State also in the mix there. We know the Broncos have bigger goals, though. Their running back, Ashton Ginty, you see him on your screen, hoping his Heisman campaign continues. He, of course, set the Mountain West record with his 10th consecutive 100-yard rushing game. He leads FBS with over 1,800 rushing yards and 26 touchdowns. They could be a competitor. As you look here at our Jerry Palm's current college football playoff projection, Boise State currently holds the 4 seed. Elsewhere, the rest of those byes look like this. Oregon, the number 1 overall seed. They, of course, get the bye for the quarterfinals there. BYU, one of Colorado's biggest competitors in the Big 12, get the 3 seed, and then Texas out of the SEC holding on to number 2. Those back 4 brackets, though, could be very interesting, especially when you ask our analyst how they're feeling. Kind of a tale of 2 stories here. So our Danny Kanell has been very anti-SEC. No surprise, the kid went to Florida State. But he posted this tweet yesterday saying, "I give you the most dominant conference in all of the land." And if you notice, it's all the SEC teams taking L's on this screenshot. However, our Josh Pate wanted to go toe-to-toe with Danny himself. This is the definition of standing on business, guys. Josh Pate, getting on a flight, wanted to go head-to-head with Danny Kanell to argue this point. So here's what we've got. We've got the two in the studio together at the same time. They're kind of matching outfits as well a little bit.
That's
Josh
all that matches.
Pate in his signature outfit. But guys, I'm so excited to watch you go head to head. Get us up to speed here on college football.
Well, I mean, I was looking at your artwork that you put up there. You don't have the Texas-Michigan game. I'm sure you didn't have room. You didn't have, like, you know, the Georgia-Clemson game. You didn't have room for that one.
No, that one, graphically, it wouldn't support it. I had it in there, but it just had to clip it somewhere.
I know it's tough. Okay, so we were sitting here talking for a long time, and then eventually you just said, let's save it for the air.
Yeah.
All right, so we can go a million different directions. The first thing people want to know is, like, how many SEC teams are going to be in, but I cannot answer that question in a vacuum. We got to know how the rest of the field plays out. So we know we got Indiana, Ohio State coming up this weekend. First point of contention. Do you think Indiana's in even if they lose?
I think they should be, but I don't think the committee will have the same viewpoint that I do. And I think that an interesting question you said was, what do you consider a blowout? And you gave me the score of what?
31-14.
31-14, which I think it's right around the point spread's 2 touchdowns, so it's right around that vicinity. I think that would be enough. And the question I would have for you was, what was the score of the Texas-Georgia game?
30-15, yeah.
30-15. Do we ever ask about Texas? How did they look stacking up at home against Georgia? Because they didn't look good. So why did they have a different standard than Indiana does? That's what bothers me. I want everyone to be treated equally. Not a little biased because you play in a certain conference, but how do you actually look on the field? The score of the Georgia-Ole Miss game. Georgia didn't look like a playoff team on that day. They got beat by 2 touchdowns. We didn't have that barometer with them asking how did they look, so why are we going to do that with Indiana? Already knowing going into the game, like they have to hold this standard that's not even out there for anybody else. It's just them because they're the newcomer to the party and they don't have a schedule that matches up against the almighty SEC.
See, I don't do the SEC thing because you're right. There's a member of the SEC that somehow is painted as having like a 90+% chance to make the playoff in Texas that I think point blank should just be out if they lose to Texas A&M. Okay, so that's an SEC team. I'm not giving that benefit of the doubt to them. But then you went to Georgia. Georgia's a totally different story to me because unlike Indiana, Georgia has other things they can fall back on. They've got the Clemson game. Indiana's out of conference sucks, and Indiana's conference schedule is not great. Georgia's got the Texas game they can fall back on. Georgia, theoretically, will have like the Tennessee game they can fall back on, depending on how much stock you put in that. I happen to think there should be a lot of stock put in it. So I'm going to go back to this whole Indiana conversation. Like, I am of the opinion the committee will have them in, even if they lose a relatively competitive game, but they shouldn't be in. Because
even with a competitive game, if they lose by 2 points,
if they lose, because there's nothing else for them to stand on.
What about them going toe to toe with Ohio State? Because if you look at Ohio State's schedule, their biggest asset, their biggest feather in their cap is going toe to toe with Oregon. Like that's what they've got going for them.
But there's something else. They went to Penn State. They did that, and in that conversation, you would also have a win over Indiana. You understand at that point, Ohio State's resume will include them playing 3 top 5 opponents, and they will have beaten 2 of them, and they will have lost by 1 on the road to number 1. Like that resume is night and day different from Indiana. Indiana, it almost feels like the way we used to talk about a G5 team. You and I used to go back and forth about this, and you used to tell me, I think Boise's really good, and I used to say, I agree with you. There's this separate conversation. Like there is a minimum baseline of pushback your schedule has to have given you for you to even warrant consideration or to get benefit of the doubt. And it's crazy we're saying this about a Big Ten team, but that right there, the way Indiana's schedule broke this year, that is one of the Power 2 league teams whose, if they don't win that big game, whose strength of schedule does not warrant them being in. I don't think we'll ever say that again because I think they'll fix the scheduling imbalance, but this could be it. But then on the other side, we're talking about Indiana like we used to those G5 teams. And those G5 teams used to never have power and stroke behind the scenes that was going to bat for them. This is a Big Ten team. Okay, so we're going to find out how much, just like that SEC sticker matters, well, that Big Ten sticker matters a lot too. And I ultimately think that's one of the reasons why the committee will still have them in if they lose close or even relatively competitive.
Also, I think the thing that is lost in all of this is Indiana, against that schedule, has blown away almost every opponent except for Michigan. And that was, again, another test where they had to stack up differently. I mean, Oregon just struggled with Wisconsin. Didn't see that. You know, I maybe saw one person was like, I don't know if I'm going to put them number 1, but it's not like all of a sudden we're debating about them. And they have the win over Ohio State, so that's not there. I just don't like the lens that we look through Indiana differently. You know what their most impressive win is? 10 in a row. Like that's their, like they don't have a singular win that resonates, but I do think them going 10 games in a row is as impressive as anything that's out there. I will say this about the strength of schedule because it's such a conversation that's being had this year as the SEC is pounding the table saying, look at our strength of schedules. I don't know if they're that significant in the new landscape of college football where we have more parity than ever before. Like we've seen a lot of these 2-loss teams, and it's not like they're good losses. They all have kind of bad losses when you look at losing to Vanderbilt, Vanderbilt, losing to Kentucky, losing to Arkansas. Those are 500 or worse teams in the SEC. I think the parity that's out there means that these schedules, which typically were gauntlets because you're going against the powerhouses of the SEC where they had 80 and 90% 4 and 5 stars, all of a sudden that talent is spread out. So I think the regular season schedules have to matter now more than they've ever mattered before, even just 3 years ago before we saw NIL in the transfer portal.
I think they do. I think here's the poison that can creep in a little bit. You compare this year in a vacuum for the SEC against what 2017 would look like. If you're going to compare this year's SEC versus previous years, and you say, oh, the tops of the trees have been cut off a little bit, which I agree with you with, to a point at least, you also have to look around the rest of the country. Has the rest of the country continued to ascend while the SEC has been drawn back to the pack?
Yes.
I think we kind of see it in totality across the board. I was talking to someone with the Joe Moore Award the other day. The Joe Moore Award, for those that don't know, goes to the best offensive line in the country. They said, kind of in confidence, dude, we're having trouble even week to week evaluating this, because even the teams that eventually are our finalists, some are SEC, some are Big Ten, the Army may be one, there'll be such wild swings of performance, which I think we've seen all over the place. I don't just think, like, Ohio State almost lost to Nebraska, so we've seen that all over the place. Oregon got pushed by both teams from Idaho and barely survived Wisconsin. So as long as we have that sort of competitive coming back to the pack across the board, then in the aggregate, if I've got a group of teams that I think are playing top 15, top 20 caliber ball in the SEC, I'm still going to lean that way. I'm still going to talk about your relative strength of schedule, even if it doesn't match up to what you've played in the past, because I don't think the rest of the country matches up to what we've seen in the past.
Here's what's going to blow you away. I think the SEC is the strongest conference in college football, which is why they're going to get 4 teams in, 3 or 4. That is double, and maybe even 4 times what the Big 12 or the ACC are potentially going to get. But that's what bothers me, is it's never enough, because you got to rig the field, stack it as much as you can, because they love to hang their banner on, we have the national champion. They lose it for 1 year, and there's a little more desperation that Michigan and the Big Ten took that title, so they want to make sure they get as many teams in, because you know what gives you a huge advantage? When you have half the field, which happened multiple times in the 4-team playoff.
This is a beautiful Overton window move by you. This is, look, I believe in the SEC.
I'm willing to give them that they are the strongest, but they're not where you get half the field. That's where I draw the line.
This is what Jake Paul felt like last week. You're on the ropes right now. I want to ask you, who's getting left out? Okay, so if you put 4 SEC teams in, and this is considering that they all win. Right. It could be a car wreck and then it's all rendered moot. But if they all win, like when it comes right down to it, when you're looking at the resume of, let's say, an Indiana. I know we keep going back to them, but like an Indiana.
Or Penn State. What about Penn State's resume isn't great?
It could be like we're talking also about a Notre Dame, not whether they'll make it or not. If they win out, they make it. But this other thing that popped up over the past 24 or 48 hours is the Lane Kiffins of the world talking about how valuable the risk reward is about playing a conference championship game, which you know is like nails on a chalkboard to those league offices.
Right.
So enjoy that while you can. I don't think you'll hear that much longer. But here's the thing. The loser of the conference championship game. So right now, if Bama wins out, they're on track to play Texas in Atlanta. If Bama were to lose, which I think there would be a point spread dog. So let's say for argument's sake they lose. Let's say they went in there as like a 7 seed and they lose. Are you dropping them at all? Because if they go from being in position to host a home playoff game to falling behind a Notre Dame that just sat at home and did nothing, you have so completely de-incentivized making that conference championship game that's going to be a big problem. And like, I'm not asking, is the loser going to fall out?
Right.
I'm asking, is the loser going to fall, period?
They should not.
I agree with you.
And neither should SMU or Miami or Colorado or Arizona State or anybody else that's in a conference championship.
Right. Every conference game is equal,
everyone should matter. This is the biggest flaw, I think, of the new system. That's why I think they're going to blow it up again after 2 years after this experiment that we see, because there is almost no incentive to winning your conference. Sure, you can get the playoff bye, but ask Nick Saban in 2017 if he minded not being the SEC champion or even the division winner because he didn't have to play in it. Didn't impact him at all. He got a bye and got to win the national title. It happened to Ohio State too. Now, they didn't win the national championship that year, but we've seen it in the previous system where you can get a benefit of not having to play that extra game. And in most cases, if you're the team sitting at home, you probably get a home playoff game, which you would take every single time. So yeah, you don't get the bye of winning. You get the bye of sitting home watching those other teams. And Notre Dame is the team that bothers me the most. All those 2-loss teams that you mentioned in the SEC, I'd say put them all in over Notre Dame because they won't even subject themselves to a conference championship game.
You know Brady's going to have pushback.
I don't care what he says. I don't care what he says.
All right, so we're going to just go in the hallway and continue this. I think we're out of airtime, but it's not over.
I won.
It's not over. It's like the end of the first quarter.
It's probably going to settle itself on the field, and they're going to get 4, maybe 3, but
if
probably
it doesn't,
4.
But if it doesn't, I'm charging
Watch
my phone
out.
just in case. Yes.
Guys, who needed that Jake Paul, Mike Tyson fight?
That's
you
right.
guys gave us the heavyweight matchup right here. Certainly a lot to think about as we get closer to that college football playoff bracket reveal. Reminder, the next round is coming tonight at 7 p.m. But in the meantime, make sure you get locked into the crew on Saturday mornings. Look at this lineup. Danny Kanell, you just heard him chat there with our Josh Pate. He is a part of our 3-hour college football pregame show that starts at 9 a.m. Saturday mornings. 3 hours of uninterrupted football coverage for your college football needs.